Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to the third day of our conference. My name is Marlene Sahakian, and I have the great pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker today. But as has been the custom, I will also briefly present the network that I represent, SCORAI Europe. So the Sustainable Consumption Research and Action Initiative Europe chapter was founded in 2012. It is basically a group of practitioners and researchers, many of whom are in this room, who contribute to forward-thinking research on sustainable consumption. Early on, we were able to band together and join forces on European projects like Energize, Energy Prospects, among others. We're also quite committed to teaching materials. You can go on our website and find a lot of resources for teaching sustainable consumption in the classroom, and there's also an edited book that gathers many of the contributions from many of you in this room. We work closely with our sister organizations, SCORAI Global, and with the European Roundtable for Sustainable Consumption and Production. And we're a relatively flat organization. You just have to send us an email, basically, to become a member. And I wanted to ask the members of the steering committee if they could stand up. Yay! So, so the idea is, please reach out to any of them over the course of the day if you want to learn more about the network. So now, I have the great honor and pleasure of presenting Professor Tim Jackson, an ecological economist and writer. Tim has been director of the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity at the University of Surrey since 2016. In 2004, he joined as Economics Commissioner the UK Sustainable Development Commission. And in 2005, he wrote an article that was incredibly inspiring to me. I think it launched maybe 10 years of research for me and maybe for many others. And this article in the Journal of Industrial Ecology was posed a question. Living better by consuming less, he asks, is there a double dividend in sustainable consumption? His work for the SDC culminated in a groundbreaking book, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Prosperity Without Growth, Foundations for the Economy of Tomorrow. It was first published in 2009, and there is a new edition in 2017. The report on which that book was based came out, from what I've just learned, exactly the same day as the start of a G20 summit in London that ran with the title, Growth, Jobs, Stability. So you can imagine that the report coming out at that time probably raised a few eyebrows. But it went on to being a hugely successful book, as you all know, translated into more than 20 languages. And his subsequent book, Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism, in 2021, also with Prosperity Without Growth, has won numerous awards. In 2016, Tim was awarded the Hillary Laureate for exceptional international leadership in sustainability. We're here to hear him present his latest book, which I'm so excited to hold in my hands. Look at this beautiful cover, The Care Economy. So when I tell my students, try to explain to bachelor students, what is the economy? I always start with, well, somehow it's about interdependencies, it's about relations. And I think when it comes to our social relations, nothing can be more fundamental than care. And yet it seems quite absent from the way we think about economics. So, dear Tim, we're really looking forward to your insights this morning. It's an honor to have you give one of the first talks on the book to our community. The floor is yours. Thank you, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, SCORAI. I mean, what a fantastic thing to come to the third day of a conference that starts at 8 o'clock in the morning and ends at 10 at night and find the room is still full. SCORAI rocks. It's, yeah, I think so. A round of applause for just being here, So, and thank you to my predecessors, my precursors, my past and my present keynote speakers for laying out such solid foundations, exploring some of the most difficult questions, in fact, that sustainable consumption has to face, and handing on the baton to me to talk about the future. It seems both kind of scary and slightly unlikely that I should take up that baton, given that I will probably see less of the future than many of you will see. And yet, thank you for the honor. I feel it as a privilege, and I am delighted to be able to do that, and in the process to say something about the care economy, which, as Marlene just told you, is the title of that lovely-looking book. Never judge a book by its cover. Read it, please. So I called the talk, This is an Act of Care. And it comes from an act that took place about 4 years ago, almost to the day, actually, when 9 women turned up at HSBC headquarters in Canary Wharf in London and took out of their rucksacks chisels and hammers and set about breaking the glass on HSBC headquarters. It was Extinction Rebellion action, and the 9 women were arrested, but not before they had broken the glass. And what they were trying to do was to draw attention to the fact that HSBC, although turning up in 2015 at the Paris Climate Agreement, and signing up to no more new fossil fuels, had invested £80 billion in new fossil fuel investments in the 5 years between that 2016 agreement and the action in Canary Wharf. 9 brave women, 9 women dressed, actually, interestingly, in reference to the previous session in this room on sustainable fashion by Stella McCartney, in colours which were mostly green and purple, reflecting the movement of the suffragettes 100 years before them, and with this slogan, better broken windows than broken promises. Again, it was a slogan that had been used before them. So these were women who were drawing attention to climate change in a very particular way, with hammers and chisels, by breaking the glass. And on the hammers and chisels were written a variety of words. This was actually Claire Farrell's hammer, and on it was written the word love. And the chisel says, "We act with love." And another of the protesters, Susan Reed, when she was being interviewed, argued that what they were engaging in was an act of care. This is an act of care, she said. I've spent my life caring for the people around me. I refused to stand by while HSBC poured money into the very thing we know is causing unimaginable harm. As I said, they were arrested, they were carted off. It was not a good time to be arrested, actually. In the UK at that point, the political movement was away from protest. It was about criminalizing protest. Even people who were conscientiously protesting, if you like, about climate change, even if they were protesting about something we know is causing unimaginable harm, that was an offense that could be punished with prison, and the women knew that, and they turned up anyway. Susan Reed was in her 60s at the time. She was retired, but she'd spent her whole life as a community care worker and felt that what she was looking at was non-sanctionable, unsanctionable, unforgivable, and that somebody needed to draw attention to it. So that's it's a little bit of a provocation, because of course it isn't obvious that turning up and smashing windows is an act of care. But I want to kind of lead you towards a sense of answering that question for yourself. Is it or is it not an act of care? And in what sense is it or is it not an act of care? And that's partly the way that I'm tying together the talk today. But let me go back to where, as Marlene reminded me before we started, the place where I am not allowed to forget, which was that report some time ago, Prosperity Without Growth. There it is. That's the original report. there's a little bit of a story around the cover, actually, when we're speaking of covers. We hadn't got a cover. We had no idea what we were going to do. And we knew it was the week before the G20, so we wanted to have a cover that would be getting some attention. And there was a young man, I think he was, working in the communications department at the Sustainable Development Commission, and he was sent out on this Thursday or Friday before the report had to go to the printers with the instructions to come back with something that would work as a cover. And he came back with this, which is absolutely wonderful, actually. Please find alternative route. It was just a picture of a street in London which was rocked with roadworks and jammed and obviously couldn't go anywhere. And so it actually provided not just a kind of cover for the book, but actually a sort of alternative title for the book, which in some ways has been a kind of alternative title for my life. Because even though Prosperity Without Growth took off, it became, in spite of not being the government's favorite report, it became very, very well read, and I became very heavily associated with it to the extent that it's quite difficult not to talk about it sometimes. And the main thing that caused that was this questioning of growth. But it does seem to me, and this is just to tie back to Frank and Manisha's talks before, that there is something around that pursuit of growth that really is important in understanding the progression of consumption through history, as Frank has given it to us, and indeed through colonialism, as Manisha has given it to us. And in fact, arguably, growth is the driver that we have to, the most difficult driver that we have to face if we want to think about the future. It's kind of coming at us, whether we like it or not. We live in that growth-based society. It's almost a fetish. And even though growth is gradually disappearing, particularly in Western economies, our politicians are still so attached to it that it becomes a driving force in politics. It is a driving force in business. It's what leads to that expansionary model. And so not to be able to bring growth into the room and say, actually, this has to be something to do with the way that we approach sustainable consumption in the future would be an omission. But I want to focus instead, actually, at this point, on the other bit of the title, which is prosperity. And I want to focus on an idea that actually has its roots in prosperity without growth, that instead of thinking about prosperity as wealth, it would be better to think of it as health, as our well-being, if you like. And I use a fairly broad definition of health here that belongs to the World Health Organization from 1948, which actually defines it in terms of a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of infirmity or disease. So it's a definition of health that sits very much with the ideas around the well-being economy, which you're very familiar with. It's a definition of health which actually, when you ask people what matters to them in their lives, what their hopes and expectations are, what prosperity means in its original meaning, then you find that health comes up pretty near the top. Health matters. And it matters in personal terms, it matters in terms of our family and our friends, it matters in terms of our community. It doesn't just matter in physical terms, it matters in psychological terms as well. And it matters, of course, in terms of the health of the planet. And all of these things can be gleaned from talking to people about what matters. My colleagues and I in the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity had a long-running postcard series where every meeting everywhere we would give them postcards, and the top just said prosperity is, and people had to fill it in. And this bubble map, or whatever it's called here, was one of the things that came out of one of those exercises, and it gives a sense, this sense that prosperity is not just about wealth. It is, to some extent, more fundamentally about health. And when you start to think about prosperity as health, then you begin to realize that actually the relationship between income and health is not a linear one. Many of you will have seen a diagram like this. The vertical axis measures life expectancy, and the horizontal axis measures the income per capita. And what you find, and this is an important point to retain, is that when incomes are low, and particularly when they're very low, you get a big increase in health when you increase those incomes. So it's not to say there's no relationship between income and health, between wealth and health. There clearly is, and the data show that at every level. They show it particularly where incomes are low. And in fact, what you see here in the graph is a doubling of life expectancy from having virtually nothing in sub-Saharan Africa to having around $10,000 or $15,000 in Latin America. In other words, that's where health and income are to some extent very closely aligned. And then something strange happens, that curve tails off, and in fact you have some paradoxical results. The UK, the US, Ireland even have life expectancies which are less than those in Latin America, which is a bizarre thing to find if you believe that actually prosperity is delivered to us by income. And clearly, up to a point it is, and up to a point it may not be. In other words, it's a non-linear relationship. Health doesn't behave the same as wealth. And this was one of the key ideas. It was not always focused on in Prosperity Without Growth, but there was another one, which was to ask, what kind of economy should we be looking for if we take as our guiding star this idea that prosperity is largely about health? And that's a place where we begin to think in terms of the care economy. If you're looking after health, then it makes sense that you have to some extent, be focusing on care. You have to think about care, at least. And that means that your economy might want to think about, the healthcare industry, social care. It might want to prioritize some things which at the moment, as we all know, are very much not prioritized. And it might do this for several reasons. The first, of course, is it contributes to our quality of life. It really contributes to our prosperity. The second is that it's, interestingly, very employment-rich. It's a labor-rich place, and that's largely because of those activities of care take time. And time is something that can absorb labor in its tasks. I remember after Prosperity Without Growth was published, going to Southern Europe, where there was youth unemployment of almost 45%, and looking around those places and thinking, is there no place that those young people could be employed here? Is there no work to do? But there was work everywhere. There were run-down buildings, there were run-down streets, there were run-down people. There were hospitals that were not working properly because there weren't enough nurses and doctors. There was nobody able to care for people. There was a lot of unemployment, but there was no economy in which to make use of those people in the pursuit of health. And that quality of care and healthcare as being labor-rich is a second of its major advantages. Not only does it improve our quality of life, it also gives livelihoods to people. And there's a third quality, which is a little bit even more surprising perhaps, which is this care economy, partly because it's employment rich, is not particularly carbon and material intensive. It's less carbon and material intensive than other activities. The so-called productive economy that's making all this stuff faster and faster out of material things, that's a place that is carbon and materials intensive. And this, in Prosperity Without Growth, was something that I had posited in some relatively hypothetical way. And in the interim, I and my colleagues have done quite a lot of looking at the data on this. And I just wanted to show you that very, very briefly. If you look at this graph, again, we have a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. The vertical axis is how carbon intensive a particular sector is. And the horizontal axis is how employment intensive it is. So if you've got a lot of jobs and a lot of carbon, you're in the top right-hand corner. If you've got no jobs and a lot of carbon, you're in the top right-hand corner, and so on. You see how it goes. And this is kind of a map of how the economies of the OECD look like at the moment. And I mean, I could actually spend the whole lecture on this, but I'm sure that not everyone wants macroeconomics, and I do want to get on to some of the philosophy and the sociology behind it. But it is a kind of important moment to pause and look at this and see that, yes, empirically, statistically, you can make that distinction. There is a very materials-intensive manufacturing economy, for example. There's also, interestingly, tech and finance, which at the moment lives in the bottom left-hand corner of that graph. What does that bottom left-hand corner means? It means it's low in carbon, but also very low in jobs. Now, I can see some people already sort of saying, well, what about, data farms and so on and so forth? That number is likely to go up. And it is, in fact, bits of that are becoming very intensive. In fact, it's only so low on my graph because I conveniently aggregated finance and tech. And finance does have a lower profile and employs virtually no one and does almost nobody any good except for the people who work in finance. So, but the point of the graph and the point of the analysis is to say, yes, there is a set of activities here on the bottom right which can be thought about as the care economy. And what would it look like as a future, actually, if this was what we focused on? What our economy is focused on. What would it look like if that's the direction of travel? Could we think of it as a specific place? This is the EU graph to follow on from my OECD graph. But think of this as our destination, a place to be. This is an economy that makes sense. It's an economy that works. It's an economy with livelihoods. It's an economy with low impact. It's an economy that we could think of as a target trajectory for some of those other sectors that our manufactured goods, instead of being mass-produced with a lot of energy consumption, become crafted goods which are durable and recyclable and reusable. And indeed our food products, which are, and I'm coming on to this, mass manufactured in engineered ways and are undermining our health, could actually become real food in slightly more labor-intensive places maybe, but also less destructive places. So this is one idea. It's, if you like, a slightly instrumental idea. It's an economist's idea of where you might think of sustainable consumption as a destination for the economy as a whole. And it gives us something else other than product-specific innovations on the one hand. Of course, they're all really, really important, or indeed tech fixes on the other hand. And again, I'm not rejecting those tech fixes. Some of them are important. Some of them will be important to get from those high-intense manufactured goods into what we might call the care economy. Others will be essential to decarbonize our electricity, our energy systems, and we cannot do anything really without that. So it isn't to reject that technological approach to the future, but it is to say there's another way of thinking. There's an avenue that is worth exploring for a different kind of economy, organized in a different way around a different set of activities. But I want to go further than that. I want to say actually that I'm not talking about subsectors of the economy. I'm talking about economy as care. And the idea that we could think of the economy differently from the one that we think at the moment by putting this one principle, and I'm going to argue that it is an absolutely fundamental organizing principle for organic life. And therefore, it makes sense to think about it as a fundamental organizing principle for the economy. And of course, you have to, at some point, define care. I haven't done that yet. Here is Joan Tronto and Berenice Fisher's definition, which is a good working place to start from. Care is an activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. It's a nice definition. And together with that definition of health, I think what it makes you wonder is, why aren't we already doing it? Why is the economy not already doing it? If prosperity is about health and well-being, and care is about maintaining and repairing our world, why does that not happen? And to be fair, I mean, that largely was my experience writing the book, was a kind of coming from a place where I wanted a very simple message: prosperity as health, economy as care, realizing that in some sense it's blindingly obvious, and then going back to the question, why does the blindingly obvious not happen? And so the book is as much a journey into that question of why the blindingly obvious doesn't happen, as it is anything else. And here I'm just going to sketch some of what I came across in the light of that. And let's start with something, a case study, if you like, around health. In the writing of the book, I began to look at the burden of disease, how health needs and health care has changed. between, let's say, 1948, when the National Health Service in the UK was one of the first health services to provide universal health care free at the point of need for everyone. And now in 2025, decades later, the burden of disease has changed massively. So mostly what the NHS was doing back in 1948 was treating infectious disease and workplace injuries. Mostly what it's doing now is treating chronic disease. Most of the burden of disease worldwide is chronic disease. 74% of deaths worldwide are from chronic diseases, not from infectious diseases, not from workplace injuries, but from chronic diseases whose causes lie more in the way that we live, in our diet, our lifestyle, our conditions of work, our recreation, the way that we engage with each other, the environmental toxins that we're exposed to, much more in those causative factors rather than a germ that is wandering around polluting people's bodies and making them sick. And yet our healthcare system hasn't quite caught up with that. In fact, it's now trying to meet an almost unpayable healthcare bill around the world. Some staggering numbers, something like 47 trillion between now and the early 2030s, will be spent on managing chronic disease, managing these diseases whose causes come from the way that we live. And I wanted to know, this actually is a piece of work that followed after the book. It's in a report to the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. I wanted to know what those costs might actually look like. So I tried to put together some numbers. And these are, I mean, you know, you're not all British, but you probably, those who aren't British will know even more than those who are British, that you shouldn't be that surprised about the British diet. So to find that there's some health-related costs to the British diet is not that surprising. But before you rest on your laurels, it doesn't change massively in other countries. And in some countries, the US, for example, it's significantly worse. A lot of money is spent trying to manage food-related impacts on our health from chronic disease. And the numbers that I came up with for this report, which were relatively conservative actually, £268 billion every year, managing the food-related health impacts from chronic disease. And they range across the healthcare costs themselves, the social and welfare costs because people are out of work, the loss of productivity in the economy, and indeed that almost intangible thing that we're losing quality of life. We're actually losing prosperity because we're gaining morbidity and we're gaining earlier mortality because of these costs from chronic disease, from things that come from food. So the point, I guess, here is that there's a couple of arguments. Let me just talk about each of them in turn. The first argument is there's no point in trying to ask people to change their diets because people can't afford to feed themselves as it is. And that's true. The lowest income deciles cannot afford to feed themselves. And many of them rely on food banks. Many of the people who work in the care system rely on food banks to survive. Many of the people who work in the food system rely on food banks to survive. You're producing a commodity which you can't afford to buy, so you rely on someone else's charity to provide it for you. I mean, this is a broken food system. But it's broken in other ways as well. It's broken in the sense that it's driven largely by what I would call engineered calories, by processed foods, which can be produced very cheaply, which can be manufactured to last, which can be shoved down our throats, actually because, unfortunately, they can be engineered to appeal to our own neurobiology. In fact, the food industry has done this systematically. It has systematically weaponized our own neurobiology to sell us foods which are systematically making us sick. And it's done this in the name of profit. And because it's produced profit, it's been legitimized in the face of government policy, and it's been very, very difficult to change. But there's no point really in looking at this dysfunctional system and not seeing it like it is. There's no point in believing that individual effort can have you overcome your own neuropsychology. You actually have to begin to unpack what's going on. And thanks to a lot of very, very good food researchers and some doctors, a great number of doctors actually. Chris Van Tulleken, for example, in the UK is one of them. This dynamic is now being unpacked, and Chris Van Tulleken in a documentary called Irresistible, just before, I think it went out just before Christmas, sometime around then, went into the food companies and talked to the food companies and asked them, how did you get to be engineering the foods in this way? And they were very, very blunt about it. They were searching by participant interaction and testing foods with little small groups for what they called the bliss point, the point at which the food became irresistible. They were not looking at nutritional quality. They were not looking at health effects. They were trying as much as they could to operate within what limits there were and what regulations there were. But they was in search of the bliss point, something which looked like prosperity, something shite and briny. That's not the right way around, is it? No. Bright and shiny, that would be irresistible to us. But it's amazing what the brain does when it's not looking. I'm going to have to remember that one. And they are able to do this because of our own evolutionary psychology. We evolved in an environment when sugar, salt, saturated fat were in very, very scarce supply, and so we craved them. Our reward circuits, our dopamine operates off the surprise we get when we find some quantity of sugar, salt, and saturated fat. And there were neuropsychologists on the teams looking for the bliss point to make the food irresistible. The same food that would then have to have preservatives in it, that would have toxins in it, that would undermine our nutritional quality, that would rip out dietary fiber, that would do all the things that would destroy our health and leave us with an epidemic of chronic disease. The argument has always been, you can't fix the problem. But actually, that's the second bar on my graph here. You could pay every household in the country a supplement to make up the difference between the cheap engineered calories that they're being force-fed by an industry that's weaponizing our psychology to make profit, and give them real food, whole food, food that has dietary fiber, food that has nutritional quality, food that is good for us, food that does us well, food that helps us develop, helps us stave off chronic disease and develops our capacity, that actually creates us as human beings. We are the food that we eat, as many people have said. And it would be cheaper. It would be cheaper. That cost, that additional cost of providing that food would be a quarter of what we spend trying unsuccessfully to manage chronic disease. And that's a kind of extraordinary finding. But it's also a finding that is potentially very useful because it's something you can take into a treasury that is trying to balance its books. Potentially, you can take it into a treasury that's trying to balance its books and say, look, we are losing this money out of the economy year upon year upon year. And we do not know how to manage this epidemic of chronic disease. But we could actually feed people properly. And we could set up the structures for farms, for agricultural policy, for food supply chains. We could regulate what the supermarkets are doing better. We could provide support for those farmers who are trying to produce real food. We could provide support for the networks through that food is sold into the markets. We can do all that because we are a government and because it would be cheaper. It would be cheaper than what we're doing at the moment. It's still a hard message to take into government. Many messages are hard to take into a government, believe me, but we are in the Food Farming Countryside Commission committed to trying to do that. But I want to just point out to you another perversity that arises out of this already perverse and dysfunctional situation. I mentioned already that it's the drive for growth that to some extent is the force behind what's happening here. And it's happening in the food industry. But guess what? It's also happening in the pharmaceutical industry. So these are projected growth rates on the left-hand side for various foodstuffs, cereals, sugars, confectionery, so on and so forth. And on the right-hand side is the projected growth rate for all the things we try to treat the chronic disease that is caused by eating all the things on the left-hand side. Both things contribute to growth. Both things are seen by government as a contribution to prosperity because they contribute to growth. So here you have this growth driver played out in a very particular way, in a very perverse way, in a way that's actually undermining our health. And when you look at those numbers, in particular that number on the right-hand side, which some of you might be able to read is semaglutides, it's anti-obesity drugs, this is a kind of a technological growth-driven strategy for trying to address what is a systemic problem caused largely by the growth imperative itself. We have neglected care, we've neglected health, even within the healthcare system, even in our thinking about health. And in fact, part of what I do in the book is trace through the historical roots of how and where that happened, and look at the point in time at which the rise of the pharmaceutical industry coincidentally and happily collided with the rise of capitalism. And in fact, much of that work that created what's called modern scientific medicine was created through a report that was funded by the Carnegie and Rockefeller foundations in the early 20th century. In other words, we created a healthcare system that works for capitalism, but is undermining our health. So even in healthcare, we don't have a care economy. And that's the depth to which we have to look if we want to understand why this is happening. But we have to go deeper still. And one of the places that we have to go deeper, and this will be obvious, I am sure, to almost everybody in the audience, and certainly those who are not of my gender, that most care work is carried out by women. There is an still undeniable gendered division of labor in relation to care and thinking about care. 3/4 of unpaid and paid care work worldwide is carried out by women. Much of it is unpaid, much of it is underpaid. So there is something here that we have to confront if we want to look at the systemic reasons why this is happening. And the Global Gender Gap Report is a very interesting place to start. When I wrote the book, when I was writing the book, I didn't have the most recent report available, but I was struck by one number in that report, which was across 4 indicators, the progress towards total gender parity is so slow that we're not expected to get there for 133 years. A year later, I looked at the report, and you can see the number here. It's 134 years this year. Now, my maths might not be that strong, but I think if you've gone a year closer to your target date, you should be a year closer to your target date. And yet we've somehow gone a year back from our target date. So we are not going in the right direction, and we're not even going at a first differential in the right direction. We're sort of accelerating away from it. And of course, we're doing that in a context, and I do want to talk about this, and it's a little bit tricky, but I do want to talk about it in the context of something else which is very, very gendered. And that's violence. When I was writing the book, in the early stages of writing the book, I was writing it in a context just after the pandemic, when actually we were applauding care workers on our doorsteps and able to think that finally at last we might be able to take care seriously. Very soon after that, Russia invaded Ukraine. Not long after that, Gaza, Hamas invaded Israel. Israel responded and has almost flattened Gaza. We were living in a world in which care was so far from our minds, and we were rushing towards a world in which violence was at the forefront of our minds. And when we look at the gender division of violence, we have to accept, first of all, that men are predominantly those who enact violence, and that violence is predominantly acted on women, and then in many cases that violence is state-sanctioned. And this is a point when we have to give pause for thought. And this was pointed out by the feminists in the 1970s, the second wave feminists in the 1970s. We condition young girls into care, and we condition young boys away from care. And this is a systematic forcing of the genders into particular parts for functional reasons in society. And violence itself is functional in society if you think about the progress of society as being about territory, power, domination, and even possibly security, which is a tougher one. But I guess my point is in witnessing during the writing of the book this transition from a world which was caring about care to one which was careless of anything but violence, I was drawn towards something which the writer Kathleen Lynch spoke about in a book called Care and Capitalism, where she pointed out that you cannot hope to understand care unless you approach, confront, and try to understand care's nemesis, which is violence. And so that leads us into a place where we have to think about confronting violence. And it leads us into it at a point in time which is incredibly difficult. As the figures here on my graph, on my slide show, what's being talked about now in Europe, for example, a rearmament of Europe, is massive sums of money suddenly available in order to create defense, which actually is a sort of euphemism and masquerades mostly as violence. Most of what the rearmament means is to invest in things that will destroy people and destroy buildings and destroy lives. And the extent to which that money is available in the EU, for example, by 2030 is something like 800 billion euros. By comparison, in the post-pandemic resilience and recovery fund, only about 53 billion euros were spent in the last 4 or 5 years. And in relation to the EU for Health, the health dedicated project, the amount of money is 5.3 billion, a fraction, a minute fraction of what we're prepared to spend rearming ourselves in pursuit of what ends up as violence is being spent on health. There is a political priority there that we have to be clear about. We have to look at what we're being told about that need and about the sums of money that are available. And we have to set it in the context, it seems to me, of what needs to happen to create a secure society that delivers prosperity as health and that operates through care. And in order to do that, we have to go one step further in our analysis. I want to try to sketch for you, and in the last couple of minutes, so it's a little bit ambitious, but I want to try to sketch for you something that does speak both to what Frank talked about in the first keynote and perhaps in particular to what Manisha talked about yesterday. How is it that we can get beyond the point of saying that colonial capitalism has created a violent world? Can we dare to look that in the face and ask ourselves where that came from? And a part of the book is an attempt to do that. And I won't be able to do it the justice it deserves here, but it starts from a very strange place, which is right back at the World Health Organization definition of health. It's a complete state of physical, psychological, mentally, they use the word, and social well-being. And what's clear is that it isn't just physiological health. Care must be care not just for physiological health, it must also be care for what I call symbolic health. What is symbolic health? It's the psychological well-being that we pursue. It's the sense of meaning and purpose and relationship and status and belonging in society. It's the sense of affiliation. It's the things that drive us both towards relationship and indeed sometimes towards consumption and consumerism. And that symbolic health matters. It must also be the focus for care in the care economy. But there's a couple of things about this symbolic health that lead us down a very, very slippery slope. I mean, you can think of it immediately by my explanation that, sometimes in pursuit of psychological well-being, we go into consumerism. Shopping makes you feel good. Mrs. Bush and I would like to encourage Americans everywhere to go out shopping as the first response to the Twin Towers in 2001. The sense, actually, that we are drawn through consumerism to search for this idea of symbolic health is one that is both curious and challenging. But there's something else going on as well, which I just want to kind of draw your attention to briefly through two amazing books that have been very influential in my own work. One is this book from Hannah Arendt called The Human Condition. And Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition makes a very interesting division between what I would broadly call the care economy, the labor of care, the stuff of trying to keep ourselves together, of provisioning us, of keeping body and soul together, and what she calls that labor in the book. And then she has another term which she calls work. Why is work? Why does she want to differentiate work from labor? Well, it's this. One of the things that you can do if you've mechanized enough, if you've organized your society well enough, is you can reduce the time that you spend in care. And capitalism, as it turns out, is a good vehicle for doing that because it chases labor out of care continually through labor productivity growth. But once you've done that, something very interesting happens. You know, instead of working from dawn till dusk every day and sleeping the sleep of the just, you have a bit more time on your hands and you begin to think of yourselves and think about your society and who you are. And the first thing that strikes you, and it is very, very uncomfortable, is that you are a finite, sentient being who is going to die. And according to Aaron, this realization, the realization of our finitude, of our own mortality, draws us into the work of world building. We have to build something that's a little bit more permanent because of our own impermanence, because we're terrified of our own impermanence. And so we're drawn into a world of work, what she calls work, which is about building and building and building, creating something that would last, creating something that lasts beyond us. Our reputation lasts beyond us if we work well enough at it, but so do the skyscrapers, so do the bridges, so do the armies, so does the territory. So there's a kind of something here which you can already feel. Our attention to symbolic health is drawing us towards an activity which the sociologist Ernest Becker back in the 1970s called the denial of death. So we have a very strange thing going on, what looked like a transition towards a kind of almost instrumental vision of an economy that belongs in this wonderful place called the care economy, that is all about caring for people, and it's all lovely, and we do all the right things, and we protect our health. But part of that health is symbolic health, and how we approach symbolic health really matters. And this is really the absolute crux of the talk, because we cannot counter that by simply saying that we should care more. Care, as a morally unassailable principle, is, because it's morally unassailable, virtually useless in analytical terms. We cannot call something care and expect that that will solve the problem for us. In fact, much of what's happening at the moment is calling violence care and justifying that violence in the name of care. Some of it, even in the food system, I care for my kids by feeding them sweets all day. I care for my patients by making sure they have a continual supply of opioids that will make them addicted. I care for my friends by selling them arms to drop on the children of their enemies. These are not legitimate attitudes for anything that could be called care, but how do we counter that? And it seems to me that fundamentally we have to go right back to that physiological metaphor. We can only say what care is if we understand what health is. And the one thing that health is, above everything else, is a balance. This was pointed out by the physiologist Walter Cannon back in 1932 when he talked about the wisdom of body and gave the world the language of homeostasis. We work through a system as individual organisms that is all about balance. It's about the balance of our blood sugar, to take a convenient example from the food, which is disrupted by a system of capitalism that constantly draws us out of that balance. We're in balance in relation to our dopamine and our reward circuits. We're in balance in relation to our pulse, our heart rate, our blood acidity. The whole system works through balance. And that means that care, if we're thinking about it as a force to create health, has to have very particular characteristics. It has to be seen essentially as a restorative force. In the kind of way, interestingly, that the moon is a restorative force. The moon actually is what keeps the climate stable. It's what creates the interstitial ranges where organic beings that were once in the sea managed to find enough of a purchase to create organic beings that lived on the land. That's us. We would not be here but for the moon, but for the moon's constant attention. Even today, it regulates the movement of the tide, the movement of the water, the movement of the habitats. It's, if you like, a primary carer in a system of maintaining both our health and planetary health. And then there's a secondary role of the carer in the homeostasis that makes sure that we are constantly in attention to the balance in our bodies. And my argument is, and I will leave this with you really as a provocation more than anything else, that in seeing care in this way as a restorative force, we give it not just a firm principle, but a principle that can be used. In fact, very much as Walter Cannon thought that it could be used to regulate our economies. Another way of thinking about the future of sustainable consumption is to argue that taking care as a central organizing principle in the economy will lead us back into balance, will lead us back into health. What should we do about it? I've left that till last. I know, Manisha, that was your primary task and expectations for me. And I'm so sad not to have fulfilled that trivial thing. But I'm going to leave you with something which is a kind of compensation for that, which is this wonderful quote from Alan Watts, which I wish someone had said to me before. The question, what should we do about it, is only ever asked when we don't understand the problem. I mean, when I first came, I did laugh. I kind of wished, if only I'd had that when number 10 was going ballistic over the publication of Prosperity Without Growth, that everything would be fine. But I do accept that that's not quite enough. So I want to just very quickly summarize. Where does this take us? It takes us to the idea that there are guiding principles for us. Care as a principle. Not as a morally unassailable good, not as a subsector of the economy, not as something that we wave around to try and claim the moral high ground, but as a principle, and the basis of that principle is restorative. It is also the case that in operating in this restorative way, we're investing in something. So we can think of care as investment. And when you think of something as investment, actually, it's a place where governments can do something different because they can fund and finance investment in ways which are different from funding and financing what looks like current expenditure. You can place care in that part of government budgets that they allow themselves to borrow, to spend into, irrespective of the current deficits or surpluses. Insofar as it's an investment, it's also an unpaid debt. And that, I think, is absolutely paramount. It's something that we cannot neglect, that in the careless economy has a hideous unpaid debt to the care economy. And what that means is that we need specific mechanisms which transfer resources from the careless economy to the care economy. And then we can talk about what those are and how they work and how they're designed. We can do all that. It is actually a pragmatic task. But the first point is to recognize the principle, to recognize what's going on. And in that sense also, and to connect again to the point about colonialism, care as a reparation. A reparation is actually a restorative force as well. It is a way of looking at, in fact, a mechanism that the body, the physical organism knows very well, that actually it's important to marshal your resources to combat disease where it appears in the body. And largely it appears in the body as a sense of being out of balance, of things being out of balance in the body. And the restorative force, the reparative force brings them back into balance. And in doing that, and this is a strange point that Canon makes towards the end of the wisdom of the body, it can feel as though what we're preaching here is containment and of freedoms. But actually he makes a very interesting point, that it is the ability of the body to regulate its internal environment in the face of external shocks which allows that organism to be free. In an organism that doesn't have that ability, you can't do anything, basically. You're just a subject, you're mercy to these external shocks. But in a body that allows itself to regulate its own internal conditions, to restore internal conditions, to create health and balance, that gives you freedom because it gives you vitality. Vitality is what takes you out into the world. And it is ultimately this same force that allows us to distinguish between the pursuit of symbolic health through territory, through warfare, through violence, through aggression, through anger, through colonialism, and an approach to our symbolic health that actually asks those deeper questions about what it means to be human, what our meaning is, what our purpose is, how we interact with the world. And this is a freedom. This is a freedom and a point of choice. And I think it's a really important point of choice. Ultimately, I think this way of thinking about care is a kind of a red pill. It's, we've lived in the growth matrix for a long, long time, and it has created unpayable healthcare bills. It's created dysfunction. It's driving us towards war. It's a point in time in which we have to be prepared to look at the things as hard as we can in the way that they are presented to us in the world, and to explore into that depth and into that misery, even when it confronts our own prejudices, and ask, in fact, whether the future for sustainable consumption and indeed for humanity might have much more to do with this idea that we are organic beings in search of balance and that care is the restorative force that will lead us there. And that's the sense, I think, in which we could argue that the HSBC 9, to take you right back to the beginning, were acting with care, and that's what the jury thought. They were all acquitted when it came to trial. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim. We'll take a few questions. Thank you so much, Tim, for such an inspiring talk in a world that feels so careless at times. So I wanted to open the floor to questions. Yes, Vanessa.
So thank you so much, Tim. Vanessa Timmer, Wonder Earth Living, Utrecht University. Just so many thoughts. The big one that I wanted to ask you to speak about is one of the things that we think a lot about is how do we move from this consumer culture to a different culture? And I noticed arts and culture as part of the graph of in that space so that we're wanting to move towards. And in particular, I think about what you were saying at the end about the regulation of the body, because part of the care process is about that self-regulation. And what I'm noticing is that as we're confronted with this violent acts and this uncertainty, there's actually a dysregulation that's happening on a grand scale. And so I just wondered if you could speak about, there's the personal body regulation, but what can we culturally do to regulate during this period of uncertainty and violence to continue to connect and care for each other and to really turn towards that journey on this bumpy road that we're on?
Thanks, Vanessa. I mean, I do think, I know you're not doing this, but I do think it's really important to start with that kind of sense of individual action. And there's a kind of a paradox here because there's a very good woman who writes about addiction called Anna Lemke, who wrote a book called Dopamine Nation, which is well worth looking at. And it makes the point that we're continually being held out of balance at a very fundamental level in our reward circuits by technology, by stimuli, by the food that we eat, by the way that we interact, by the conditions of our work, and so on and so forth. And this has led to, she makes a really interesting point. She said, if you're not already an addict to something, you're just on the edge of becoming one, because it's all there, it's prevalent everywhere. And so, but the interesting thing about her example, which is why I'm coming to your question, is that she's an addiction doctor. She works with addicted people, and she works with addicted people to get them off the addiction. And so, her job is to show how and where at the individual level that's possible, and it is possible in various ways at the individual level. But what is not credible is to assume that just because it is possible for people, someone with the right resources and the right willpower and the right circumstances to free themselves from addiction that's destabilizing them and society, that it's possible to extend that to the population level. So we do have to think about and look at those mechanisms. And I think they draw quite a lot from kind of addiction therapy, in a sense, those mechanisms which extend that ability of the individual to act, the ability of small groups, and it's well known that small groups help the individual to act, to larger groups and communities, and ultimately not to let off the hook those who are supposedly in that regulatory mechanism of government, because they largely set the conditions under which this destabilization is happening. And I think, at all of those levels, there are ways of thinking about this, perhaps through the lens of addiction, which make a lot of sense. And ultimately, even, why is this an act of care in the sense of the HSBC 9? In part because it's drawing attention to government in ways which are distinctly rebellious to a failure of regulation that should have taken place to protect well-being. And so I do think that, from the spectrum of things, of understanding things, it goes from individual action to community working together to, arts and recreations, definitely, you mentioned that as a case, and it is one of those places where, there's the power to think differently about the future, to act differently in the world. and indeed to satisfy some of those cravings for meaning and purpose and affiliation and community that deliver symbolic health. So all of the above, plus what the HSBC 9 were doing.
Another question? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for this inspiring talk. Do you think that sustainable economic growth is possible if it's the care economy that is growing?
Very astute question. Go back to my my graph of jobs versus carbon, and economists will probably have noted that on the right-hand side of that, the right hand of the horizontal axis, that's the place which is employment rich. Employment intensity is not a good thing to conventional economists. It's the opposite of labor productivity. Labor productivity is what economists chase. And they chase that because if you can do more and more with fewer and fewer people, you can increase your margins. That means you've got greater profit. You've also got more to invest in the next technologies, which will allow you to rinse and repeat. And that's the virtuous circle that's supposed to deliver us prosperity through economic growth. And what we're talking about is a sector of activities which, as Baumol pointed out in the 1960s, resists that labor productivity growth because it's about the time and attention that people pay to each other. That's the fundamental aspect of those kinds of activities. And so you're not going to have labor productivity growth in the way that conventional economists would want to have it, and that means that you are not necessarily going to be living in a growing economy. In fact, it's one of the explanations for why the growth rate has consistently slowed down since the 1960s, is because the underlying labor productivity growth rate has slowed down, and that's partly happened because of a shift towards more service-based activities with higher employment intensities. So those higher employment intensities create jobs, but they undermine, they undercut the drive within capitalism for the pursuit of endless labor productivity. And it's one of my personal reasons for thinking that the argument from sustainable growth is not one that actually will deliver growth and probably won't deliver sustainability either.
Thank you, Kirsten Gram Hansen from Aalborg University. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I wonder, you didn't talk about care for the environment, environmental care for humans, care for more than humans or from more than humans, and not to say that all you talked about is not relevant, but I wonder if it's also part of your book or your interest to include this?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's... In a sense, I suppose I talked about it less because that's kind of where I came from, if you like. I mean, that it was from that sense of the damage that the human economy imposes on the natural world, on other species, that my interest and my motivation for exploring the idea of prosperity without growth came from in the very beginning. And I have written a lot about that in the past. I have written probably less about it in this book because I think what I've been trying to get at is those fundamental principles, but those fundamental principles absolutely apply in terms of our care for other species, our care for the planet, our care for the soil, our care for the climate, and I do make that point very clearly.
Hi, thank you so much. Lenneke Geijer from Eindhoven University in the Netherlands. I had a question, and I'm not an economist, so I don't know, maybe there's a very simple answer to this, but when I look at your graphs on the food and the medicines, it also looks like the money is definitely flowing in the direction of those already in power, so it's sort of a drainage of the powerless who are suffering from this system towards, well, it's obvious, but like how can we mobilize this huge, like the people who are actually, because those people in power, they are benefiting from this system, and those who are suffering from it have much less power. That's one question. And the other one is, what if we don't change it? Where do you see it going if it doesn't change?
Oh. Is that the future you wanted me to talk about? I mean, I do think. Let me answer the second bit first. but it does seem to me that, you know, for example, in healthcare, it's already unmanageable. Some people have even called it a pandemic of chronic disease. So just from the point of people's health, and states who are trying to manage that, facing unpayable health bills, you know, that just around that nexus of health and food, at some point, that's going to collapse. To some extent, it already is beginning to collapse, particularly in those universal healthcare systems like the NHS, which were set up under one set of conditions, trying to operate in another, now creating almost like a two-tier health system in which those in power will be able to afford that healthcare, and those will never get down the waiting lists far enough to be able to get treatments even for the conditions that are, many of them being exacerbated by the food that they're eating, which has been supplied by companies that are also benefiting a few people. So you got the dynamic. Yes, you got that dynamic right, and it is to some extent a question of power and disempowerment. But then you're in a kind of difficult terrain of asking what power is, where power lies, and where the power to change lies. And so it's a little bit like the very first question, that power to change lies in all sorts of different places. Just because we seem to be in a dynamic that is imposed by power on the powerless doesn't mean that that's impossible to change. And that's always been the case. You know, that we've seen that through history. We've seen it actually in the response to colonialism. We've seen it in the response to domination. We've seen it in the fights for independence. And our challenge, it seems to me, is not how do we confront those systems of power, but how do we confront those systems of power while remaining true to the principle of care? And that's something which I think is hard work. It's hard intellectual work. It's hard social work. It's hard psychological work. It's hard political work. But it is the task.
Hi, here. Thanks, team, for the talk. Excellent talk. Swamijit here. I just really like the mention of Becker and Hannah Arendt in this whole dynamics, because I really feel that terror management theory is something which needs to be looked at more at sustainable transition literature. So my question to you is that considering we are driven by this impermanence drive, fundamentally, all of us, if at all anything, climate change or climate crisis is going to increase this fear of death for all of us. And as terror management theory, numerous research shows that when we are faced with death, we tend to become less cooperative, less helpful to each other, and so on and so forth. How do you think, honestly, as this fear of death from external causes is increasing, what future or what directions, as how we can collectively counter this fear of death? What would be your best response?
Thank you for that. That's a really good question, and it is to some extent left a little bit open in where I've taken you so far. I would say that terror management theory doesn't just predict those responses that you've talked about. It also talks about avenues through which our mortality salience can be tempered, both at the individual level and the social level. Some of those individual level strategies depend, like the addiction strategies actually, on being in groups which support us at the community level and creating a sense and a framework of meaning. And ultimately, I would argue that our task, which is a task that was left to us by the secularization, by the falling apart of what Peter Berger calls the sacred canopy, that sense of meaning and purpose that religion once brought to us, and fell apart really through the Enlightenment, through the Industrial Revolution, through the turn towards consumer capitalism, in which we were left in a search for meaning. And we, to some extent, consumerism, I have argued elsewhere, is a response to that search for meaning. And it's an unsatisfactory one because it is a short-term response. It messes with our reward circuits. That doesn't really lead us to prosperity in terms of health. It doesn't lead us even to happiness in the sense that we want, and certainly ultimately doesn't lead us towards meaning. It leads us away from meaning into the kinds of catastrophes that make our crisis of meaning even more pressing. And so what does that mean? It means that we haven't finished. It means we do not yet know what came after religion, because it sort of pretended to be consumerism, but it wasn't. because that doesn't work. It's created a deeper crisis of meaning. And so it is a task to which we must turn. And I think the turning towards that task is one of the things that I wanted to say in the book, and it's one of the things I want to say here. It isn't necessarily to proffer what the next sacred canopy should be, but it is a call to say that in the face of these increasingly severe crises of meaning in which we are actually participative and have participated towards, we're being called to answer and to go back to those questions which we abandoned somewhere back in the middle of the 19th century and then found ourselves almost falling into nihilism and consumerism and then violence and ways of interacting that gave us a temporary defense against the crisis of meaning, but ultimately didn't allow us to address it in any real sense. And I guess that's the call, in a sense, is we're being asked to address that crisis of meaning in a fundamental sense that does justice to our own psychology, our own neurobiology, the conflicts that arise between us, and that model of health that is about balance and the restorative force of care.
I think we have time for maybe just one or two more questions. We
couple
end at
together.
11:30, don't we? So let's take a couple together. Okay.
Hello, my name is Erica, and I have a question that I guess kind of connects the macro and the micro. And I'm from the United States, and in the United States I work with foster youth, and I've been a foster parent, so I have a really close relationship to young people who have very complex trauma and addiction in their bodies, and really have to sort of be a mentor and a coach to young people who literally don't know where their next meal is coming from. And relative to that, I have a tremendous amount of privilege, but I also recognize the fact that my focus on this work and my being here in this room is a factor of being subsidized by privilege to a great extent. So I have questions and uncertainty around where the money is going to come for my rent, my food. I don't have ancestral wealth. I don't have those types of resources. So given the populations I work to support, as well as my own personal experience, I don't know what my lived experience through the transition to a care economy would look like, because I literally have anxiety about where my monthly income is going to come from. So I would love to just hear you speak a little bit to the sort of week-to-week, month-to-month experience of a person trying to do this.
Thank you. And we'll take another question all the way in the back, it looks like. Okay, over there.
Hi, Nick Evans, Ecologic Institute. Thank you very, very much for this your inspiring talk. Well, it seems that at the risk of oversimplification, or at least in part, that a lot of this hinges on the way that we raise and socialize people who identify male. And you spoke to the gender dimension of the caring economy, and also of violence versus care. But in short, I mean, the perceived constructs or otherwise, like the perceived barriers that keep men out of the heal sectors. How would you see that we overcome these and that we bring people out of finance into the sectors that are going to lead to a caring economy?
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for. I just want to say I skimmed the table of contents, and you might be interested in chapter 12 called "Fuck the Patriarchy."
Yeah, there's a chapter called "Fuck the Patriarchy," and one of the reasons. I mean, it is difficult coming to that as a male, and I think that you're reflecting my own uneasiness with the book, with the subject matter, with my approaching it as a male in a subject that has been explored deeply by many very, very intelligent, committed activist women for quite a long time. And part of my justification, if I need one for doing that, is I think it has to be something that brings men along with it. It has to be something which recognises that actually the patriarchy fucks most men as well as it fucks women. That the patriarchy is dysfunctional because it leads towards violence and aggression and warfare. There's one of the women that I quote in the book is a woman called Rianne Eisler, who in a book called The Chalice and the Blade, written back in 1987, made a kind of a distinction between two different societies, two different kinds of society. There's a society in which one gender, sex, dominates the other, and then there's another in which the genders, sexes are in partnership with each other. And I think it's very, very important to get to that place of understanding that the transition is not about a flip from one kind of domination to another kind of domination. It's a flip out of a system of domination that's dysfunctional for almost everybody in it. Understanding what the basis of that is, how we arrived at that, but also building towards those kinds of alternatives. And so, when it comes to men, I mean, I think there's a couple of things to say. One is that it's not trivial to confront it, and that we have to begin to think about ways of being men that are not drawn into that stereotype that even now we're drawn into, but we also have to confront the reasons why potentially nature itself might have had reasons for drawing us into that particular paradigm, and find a way of thinking about what it means to be a male in nature that are not inherently reliant on violence as the provision of security. And so that's tough, and it's kind of tough work, particularly when it comes to being able to talk about it with men. I mean, one of the reasons I think why I wrote the book in the way that I did was because it confronted me so much with what it means to be a man and what that is within a system which has become a system of domination, has become a system of patriarchy. And an acknowledgement that privilege, and I'm not, trying to apologize in any kind of way, but what is a privilege, seems to be a privilege, and in some sense is definitely a position of power, is also a dysfunctional element in the male psyche and becomes destructive. It becomes destructive of men. Men become kind of cheap cannon fodder for the violent aspirations of the powerful few. And that is not a model of masculinity, ultimately, that either I aspire to or that I feel leads towards a future that's secure. And so I think, the job there, and this goes way beyond really anything that we can label sustainable consumption, but it clearly does have to happen. It is very much is work at the psychological level, work at the social level, work at the norms. I mean, you can do it through regulation. You can create, as Scandinavia does, much better conditions for men to be caring, for example, in the home than we have in the Anglo-centric economies. You can do all those things, but it also relies on that, to some extent, that hard psychological work as well. And being honest, I think, about the kind of forces that have trained us into the dysfunctionality. Let me come lastly to your question, because it's a very good question, and I don't really know the answer to it, but I guess I want to just take it as an opportunity to applaud those people everywhere who are working in exactly that kind of sense of insecurity that you described so well, to maintain this restorative force of care, because there are so many of them, and there's so many examples of them, and they happen in local health, they happen in social care, they happen in education, they happen sometimes in research networks, they happen in diplomacy, they happen in addiction therapy, they happen at the local level with very small children, they happen at the other end with old people who are infirm, looking at the end of their lives. They happen on the edges of battlefields. And it's one of the stories I tell in the book, is the founding of the International Red Cross, that there is a force within our lives that can happen even, and that we can hold on to even in adverse circumstances. And that force is what keeps us away from the abyss. And for those that work there, it's often a work of sacrifice. For those that work there, it's often an unthankful, endless, and ultimately futile, as Boris Groys says in The Philosophy of Care, because we die. And yet it isn't futile in the sense that it provides this core of meaning that roots itself right back into our organic life as as human beings and as beings on a finite planet. And so it's not an answer to your question, but it is a huge round of applause to those people who work in that way.
Thank you so much, Tim. I think we're ready to get out our hammers of love and maybe some hammers of some tape or scotch tape of love as well. So it was a really inspiring talk, and we now invite you all to have lunch, and we will continue with our program for the rest of the day. Great.